Okay, welcome back to the big read after our Easter holidays. We are back reading The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. In our last bit of reading, Bod, still a very young boy, if memory serves correct, about 9 or 10, has been kidnapped by the ghouls and taken to the ghoul kingdom, and they're taking him to Ghoulheim, their sort of capital city, which is a horrible collection of holes and a massive monstrous rock in the middle of some mad desert in some fantasy world. However, the ghouls are spooked because they're being surrounded by night gaunts, these huge like bat-like creatures, and there's something out in the desert chasing them. So they've thrown Bod in a sack, which Bod is furiously trying to cut his way out of, and that's where we left him. Here we go. He attacked the sacking with his brass screw again, jabbing and pushing until he'd made another hole in the fabric. "Come on, lads," shouted the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Remember, all the ghouls have these ridiculous names. "Up the steps and then we're all home, all safe in Ghoulheim." "Hurrah, your worship," called somebody else. Probably the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. Now the motion of his captors had changed. It was no longer a forward motion. Now it was a sequence of movements, up and along, up and along. Bod pushed at the sacking with his hand to try and make an eye hole. He looked out. Above, the drear red sky. Below, he could see the desert floor, but it was now hundreds of feet below him. There were steps stretching out behind them, but steps made for giants, and the ochre rock wall to his right. Ghoulheim, which Bod could not see from where he was, had to be above them. To his left was a sheer drop. He was going to have to fall straight down, or he decided, onto the steps, and he would just hope that the ghouls didn't notice that he was making his break for it in their desperation to be home safe. He saw night gaunts high in the red sky, hanging back, circling. He was pleased to see there were no other ghouls behind him. The famous writer Victor Hugo, who's carrying him in the sack, was bringing up the rear, and no one was behind him to alert the ghouls to the hole that was growing in the sack, or to see Bod if he fell out. But there was something else. Bod was bounced onto his side, away from the hole, but he'd seen something huge and grey on the steps, beneath them, pursuing them. He could hear an angry growling noise. Mr. Owens, remember that's Bod's sort of adoptive ghost father, Mr. Owens had an expression for two things he found equally unpleasant. "I'm between the devil and the deep blue sea," he would say. Bod had wondered what this meant, having seen in his life in the graveyard neither the devil nor the deep blue sea. "I'm between the ghouls and the monster," he thought. And as he thought this, sharp, canine dog teeth caught at the sacking, pulled at it until the fabric tore along the rips Bod had made, and the boy tumbled onto the rock stairs, where a huge grey animal, like a dog but far larger, growled and drooled and stood over him. An animal with flaming eyes and white fangs and huge paws. It panted and stared at Bod. Ahead of him the ghouls had stopped. "Bloody Nora," said the Duke of Westminster. "The hellhound's got the blinking boy." "Let him have it," said the Emperor of China. "Run!" "Yikes," said the 33rd President of the United States. The ghouls ran up the steps. Bod was now certain that the steps had been carved for giants, for each one was higher than he was. As they fled, the ghouls paused only to turn and make rude gestures at the beast and probably also at Bod. The beast stayed where it was. "It's going to eat me," Bod thought bitterly. Smart Bod. And he thought of his home in the graveyard, and now he could no longer remember why he'd ever left. Monster dog or no monster dog, he had to get back home once more. There were people waiting for him. He pushed past the beast, jumped down to the next step, 4 feet below, fell his height, landed on his ankle, which twisted underneath him painfully, and he dropped heavily onto the rock. Sorry, tech issue there. He dropped heavily onto the rock. He could hear the beast running, jumping down towards him, and he tried to wriggle away, to pull himself up onto his feet, but his ankle was useless now, numb and in pain, and before he could stop himself, he fell again. He fell off the step, away from the rock wall, and out into space, off the cliffside, where he dropped, a nightmarish tumble down distances that Bod could not even imagine. And as he fell, he was certain he heard a voice coming from the general direction of the grey beast, and it said in Miss Lupescu's voice, "Oh, Bod." It was like every dream of falling he'd ever had. a scared and frantic drop through space as he headed towards the ground below. Bod felt as though his mind was only big enough for one huge thought. So, that big dog was actually Miss Lupescu, and I'm going to hit the rock floor and splat. Competed in his head for occupation. Something wrapped itself around him, falling at the same speed he was falling, and then there was the loud flapping of leathery wings, and everything slowed. The ground no longer seemed to be heading towards him at the same speed. The wings flapped harder. They lifted slightly, and now the only thought in Bod's head was, I'm flying. And he was. He turned his head. Above him was a dark brown head, perfectly bold, with deep eyes that looked as if they were very polished slabs of black glass. Bod made the screeching noise that means help in Night Gaunt. Remember, Miss Lupescu had taught him to speak a few Night Gaunt words. And the Night Gaunt smiled and made a deep hooting noise in return. It seemed pleased. A swoop and a slow, and they touched down on the desert floor with a thump. And his ankle betrayed him once again, sent him stumbling down into the sand. The wind was high, and the sharp desert sand blew hard, stinging Bod's skin. The Night Gaunt crouched beside him, its leathery wings folded onto its back. Bod had grown up in a graveyard and was used to images of winged people, but the angels on the headstones looked nothing like this. And now, bowing towards him across the desert floor in the shadow of Gulheim, a huge grey beast like an enormous dog. The dog spoke in Miss Lupescu's voice. It said, "This is the third time the Night Gaunts have saved your life, Bod. The first was when you called for help and they heard. They got the message to me, telling me you were here. The second was around the fire last night when you were asleep. They were circling in the darkness and heard a couple of the ghouls say that you were ill luck for them, and they should beat your brains in with a rock and put you somewhere they can find you again when you are properly rotted down, and then they would eat you. The Night Gaunts dealt with that matter silently. And now, this." Miss Lupescu, the great dog-like head lowered towards him, and for one mad, fear-filled moment, he thought she was going to take a bite out of him, but her tongue licked the side of his face affectionately. "You hurt your ankle?" "Yes, I can't stand on it." "Let's get you onto my back," said the huge grey beast that was Miss Lupescu. She said something in the Night Gaunt's screeching tongue and it came over, held Bod up while he put his arms around Miss Lupescu's neck. "Hold my fur," she said. "Hold tight. Now, before we go, say," and she made a high screeching noise. "What does it mean?" "Thank you," or "goodbye." "Both." Bod screeched as best he could, and the Night Gaunt made an amused chuckle. Then it made a similar noise, and it spread its great leathery wings, and it ran into the desert wind, flapping hard, and the wind caught it and carried it aloft like a kite that was beginning to fly. "Now," said the beast that was Miss Lupescu, "hold on tightly." And she began to run. "Are we going to the Wall of Graves?" "To the ghoul gates? No, those are for ghouls. I am a hound of God. I travel my own road, into hell and out of it." And it seemed to Bod as if she ran even faster then. The huge moon rose, and the smaller mould-coloured moon, and they were joined by a ruby-red moon, and the grey wolf ran at a steady lope beneath them across the desert of bones. She stopped by a broken clay building like an enormous beehive. Built beside a small rill of water that came bubbling out of the desert rock, splashed down into a tiny pool, and was gone again. The grey wolf put her head down and drank, and Bod scooped up water in his hands, drinking the water in a dozen tiny gulps. "This is the boundary," said the grey wolf that was Miss Lupescu. And Bod looked up. The 3 moons had gone. Now he could see the Milky Way. See it as he had never seen it before. A glimmering shroud across the arcs of the sky. The sky was filled with stars. "They're beautiful," said Bod. "When we get you home," said Miss Lupescu, "I teach you the names of the stars and their constellations. Those are the groups and patterns of stars in the sky." "I'd like that," admitted Bod. Bod clambered onto her huge grey back once more, and he buried his face in her fur and held on tightly, and it seemed only moments later that he was being carried, awkwardly, as a grown woman carries a 6-year-old boy, across the graveyard to the Owenses' tomb. "He's hurt his ankle," Miss Lupescu was saying. "Poor little soul," said Mistress Owens. Remember, that's his adoptive ghost mother. taking the boy from her and cradling him in her capable, if insubstantial, arms. I can't say I didn't worry, for I did, but he's back now, and that's all that matters. And then he was perfectly comfortable, beneath the earth in a good place, with his head on his own pillow, and a gentle, exhausted darkness took him. Bod's left ankle was swollen and purple. Dr. Trefusis, 1870 to 1936, may he wake in glory, that's presumably what it says on his headstone, inspected it and pronounced it merely sprained. Miss Lupescu returned from a journey to the chemist's with a tight ankle bandage, and Josiah Worthington Bart, another dead guy, who had been buried with his ebony walking cane, insisted on lending it to Bod, who had too much fun leaning on the stick and pretending to be 100 years old. Bod limped up the hill and retrieved a folded piece of paper from beneath the stone. Remember, this is a list of mythical and kind of night creatures that Miss Lupescu was trying to teach him. He didn't want to learn it. The Hounds of God. It was printed in purple ink and was the first item on the list. Those that men call werewolves or lycanthropes, that's an old-fashioned term for werewolves, call themselves the Hound of God, as they claim their transformation is a gift from their Creator, and they repay the gift with their tenacity. That means they never ever quit, for they will pursue an evildoer to the very gates of hell. Bod nodded. Not just evildoers, he thought. He read the rest of the list, committing it to memory as best he could, then went down to the chapel where Miss Lupescu was waiting for him with a small meat pie and a huge bag of chips he had bought from the fish and chip shop at the bottom of the hill, and another pile of purple inked duplicated lists. The two of them shared the chips, and once or twice Miss Lupescu even smiled. Silas came back at the end of the month. He carried his black bag in his left hand and held his right arm stiffly. But he was Silas, and Bod was happy to see him, and even happier when Silas gave him a present, a little model of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. It was almost midnight, and it was still not fully dark. The three of them sat at the top of the hill with the lights of the city glimmering beneath them. I trust it all went well in my absence, said Silas. I learned a lot, said Bod, still holding his bridge. He pointed up to the night sky. That's the big bear, and her son, the little bear. That's Draco the dragon snaking between them. Very good, said Silas. And you, asked Bod, did you learn anything while you were away? Oh, yes, said Silas. But he declined to elaborate, which means he didn't go into any more detail. I also, said Miss Lupescu primly, I also learned things. Good, said Silas. An owl hooted in the branches of an oak tree. You know, I heard rumours while I was away, said Silas, that some weeks ago you both went somewhat further afield than I would have been able to follow. Normally I would advise caution, but unlike some, the ghoul folk have short memories. Bod said, It's okay. Miss Lupescu looked after me. I was never in any danger. Miss Lupescu looked at Bod, and her eyes shone. Then she looked at Silas. There are so many things to know, she said. Perhaps I come back next year, in high summer also, to teach the boy again. Silas looked at Miss Lupescu, and he raised an eyebrow a fraction. Then he looked at Bod. I'd like that, said Bod. That's probably a good place to leave it, because it's the end of the chapter. Oh, this picture is a tantalising glimpse. The next picture gives us a tantalising glimpse at what next chapter's about. They say a witch is buried here. The next chapter is called The Witch's Headstone. Boom, boom, boom. See you tomorrow.